Welcome and thank you for standing by. At this time, all participants will be in a listen-only mode until the question and answer session. To ask a question at that time, please press star then one. Today's conference is being recorded. If you have any objections, you may disconnect at this time. With that, it is my pleasure to turn over today's call to Ms. Kelly Holloway, representing the U.S. Department of Commerce. You may begin.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. I'm very excited about the information we're going to be delivering to you through a couple of excellent, well-informed speakers. I couldn't be happier about that. Let me just set the stage and let you know that this program, Basic Guide to Exporting on Duty Drawbacks, is brought to you by the U.S. Department of Commerce, Commercial Service, the Trade Information Center. And it is one of a series. We have about 20 planned for this calendar year thus far on the basics of exporting, helping American companies be better informed about how to succeed in the export process, ranging from topics on determining harmonized system numbers, financing getting paid, determining best markets, qualifying overseas distributors, many topics. And you can find much of that information if you go to export.gov/webinars. We, in addition to having our upcoming programs listed, we have many of our past programs from last year posted there as well, where you can listen to the programs and the expertise earlier delivered to you. And this effort is brought also to bear in support of the National Export Initiative, which is a White House program focused on improving the U.S. economy via increasing exports. And there's a goal we're all working towards, which is from a 2011 base, doubling exports by 2015. So we've got our work cut out for us, and hopefully this information will bring us closer to that goal. So today, as I mentioned, we have two wonderful presenters, Michael Cerny, who is CEO with Global Customs and Trade Specialist, also the General Counsel there, and Ed Van Eck, who's President of C.J. Holt and Company. And I'll give just a real quick background on both of them and let you know that their bios would certainly be available should you want those. We'll give you full contact information at the close of the webinar and also as a follow-up to this program as well. So today they're talking about duty drawbacks, and they're going to cover some of the topics you see here about how to know if, when an import qualifies for duty drawback, finding how to pursue duty drawbacks and file the necessary paperwork, some of the best practices, and distinguishing between the different types of drawback as well. I should point out that at the top of your screen, you'll see a Q&A tab. And in that tab, if you click on that, you'll note that you'll be able to submit questions at any time during this program. Following their remarks, we will have a question and answer session where both you'll be able to type in your questions, and we'll continue to address those. And we'll also give you the chance to ask your questions verbally as well. I want to point out one other thing, which is the entree to the U.S. Commercial Service, Department of Commerce Export Support, which is export.gov. That's our main portal. It's a wealth of information you'll find there, and you'll see access to specific topics that may be of interest to you on export controls, on particular trade shows, and on finding your local Export Assistance Center. We have 108 offices around the country that work with your businesses locally to help you get your products overseas. So with that, let me go ahead and pull up the presentation as I give you a bit of background, first on Mr. Cerny. As I mentioned, he's with Global Customs and Trade Specialist. He's a licensed customs broker and specializes in duty drawback services and duty refund programs. He's also a customs attorney, so the right man for this presentation. He came to us by way of a referral from the National Customs and Brokers and Forwarders Association, where he chairs their drawback committee and has a whole host of other impressive affiliations, which, as I said, I'd be happy to share. And then following Michael, you'll hear from Ed Van Eck, who is the president of C.J. Holt and Company, where he specializes in duty drawback and advising on all facets of drawback, which you'll hear about in the presentation today, including setting up drawback operations, which your firm may be interested in after what you hear. It's also worthwhile to note that C.J. Holt is the oldest continuous operating drawback specialist firm in the United States today, having been around since 1856. So some great expertise, and I'm looking forward to your presentation. So with that, Michael Cerny.
Thanks a lot, Kelly, and thanks for having us. I really want to thank the Department of Commerce for putting on these seminars. They're really fantastic, and you know, the future of our country is in exports, and I think that this is a great way for companies, both small, medium, and large, to get more information. And this is a perfect fit. Drawback is for a lot of companies, it's somewhat of a mystery. They've heard about it somewhere, one place or another, and they're not really sure exactly what it is, but they know it's a benefit, it's tied to exports, and it has some element of imports. So Ed and I are going to try to focus on some of the basics. We may get in a little bit beyond the basics here, but we want you to be able to walk away today with an understanding of what that is and whether it's something your company can take advantage of, or when your company is looking to export markets, how they might be able to take advantage of it and make a sale where one might not otherwise be able to be made. So I'll start with the history. It's the oldest, believe it or not, drawback is one of the oldest laws in the United States. It goes back to 1789. It's a policy to assist U.S. businesses, to assist them in getting a refund back when they export out product that contains some imported product in which duties were paid. It's considered a privilege rather than a right, and what that means is that you have to comply with the drawback statute. And there are regulations, you can see them there, 19 CFR Part 191. But the key to walk away from here is it's that you must follow the regulations, and it can get a little bit complicated. So it's not unusual to reach out to experts like brokers to get that information in the drawback field. And even within brokers, there are brokers that specialize in just drawback alone. Drawback is a refund of customs duties paid on imported merchandise, which is used to manufacture articles which are subsequently exported from the United States. Well, this is kind of the original concept of drawback, that a manufacturer in the United States would import in raw materials, other components, manufacture, pay duty when the boat pulled up to the customs house dock, would pay the duty on that, and then would bring it into their factory, manufacture something, and then export out that finished product. The idea was, let's give a benefit to that manufacturer and give them those duties back, and that will foster more exports. And in addition, it's also a refund of duties paid on imported merchandise which is exported unused. Well, and this would be your distribution center concept. If you have a large North American, let's say hemispheric distribution center, and you are hitting South America, North America, the countries in North America, or even Asia, for example, you're importing the product into the United States, and then you're exporting it out. It was not used, it's just coming out of your warehouse, then you are entitled to a drawback refund. What are the things to keep in mind? What does an exportation mean? Well, it essentially means that you are sending it out to become part of the commerce of another country. And there are some trickier aspects to this, but and there are some things that are called deemed exports. You know, for example, when you might take petroleum or some petroleum product and put it onto a plane that's going to leave the United States. The idea is that you're sending it out of the United States to become part of the goods of some other foreign country. So where can you send these products to? Valid export destinations are really most export destinations you can possibly think of. You're anywhere in Europe, Asia, Africa, Australia, Central, South America. Guantanamo Bay is also an export destination. Down under possible export destinations, that's there because there are some limitations on exports to Canada and Mexico. And actually, just I would also add in there Chile. There are some limitations on exports to Chile where in most cases it's a limitation on the amount of drawback, and it has to do with the free trade agreement. But for most places you go, just about all of them, including Canada and Mexico, I don't want to discourage you from seeking drawback for Canada and Mexico, drawback is available. Places where you can't, Puerto Rico is not considered a valid export destination. And for unused merchandise only, you'll see those American possessions are available, but not for manufactured drawback. You also get drawback on goods that are exported or destroyed. And destroyed means that you do have to work with customs on that and let them know that you're going to destroy the product before it's destroyed. But you often see this in situations where companies may have obsolete product that they don't want to sell in the secondary market, so they will prefer to destroy it. And just keep that in the back of your mind if that's the type of thing that might apply to you. Also, exportation into a foreign trade zone. There are a lot of companies that will do this for one reason or another. It would have to go under zone restricted status, and zone restricted status requires that it can be exported, destroyed, or stored. What can you get back? Your basic ad valorem duty rate. Ad valorem means based on value. And that's a typical duty rate that's applied to product when it comes in the United States, 10, 5, 4, 6% of value. A specific duty rate, those are duty rates that are applied per piece or per quantity. And sometimes you can have a mixture of the two, ad valorem and specific, depending upon the product. Marking duties, 10% marking duties are paid in some instances where things are not validly marked, but those are available for drawback. Voluntary tenders, that could happen after the fact when you import something and realize that you didn't pay enough. But you can, if you export that or use it in manufacture and export, you can obtain drawback. The harbor maintenance fee, one of those things that you pay upon importation, as well as the merchandise processing fee with unused merchandise claims is available for drawback as well. Anti-dumping duties and countervailing duties are not. Get this question a lot, and they are not available for drawback. Who qualifies? The importer, like we talked before, the importer who manufactures and exports. An importer who manufactures and exports, and in this case we're talking about a purchaser. So if you have a manufacturer that purchases imported product from another party, they would get what's called a CD or a certificate of delivery when they purchase that imported product, and then when they use that and then export the finished product out, they can then claim drawback. So you don't actually have to be the importer. You could be a party that receives the item from an importer and gets a certificate of delivery. The CD must include the particulars of the importation. And when you're talking about substitution, we'll talk a little bit about that later. You can only do the substitution one time. And the certificate of delivery providers are required to keep the records of these transactions. So this is your evidence. The certificate of delivery is your evidence that you received it from someone who imported. And it's also an important document for you to keep to then use in making your subsequent drawback claim. Another circumstance where you can get drawback, and this is a little bit more complex. You have three parties involved here. You have an importer who sells the product to a manufacturer, gives that manufacturer a certificate of delivery. The manufacturer does not export the product. They manufacture, and they sell it to someone else, and that someone else exports the product out. Well, in that case, the exporter of the product can obtain duty drawback. And you would go back through the chain to get the information you need, which would include the certificate of manufacture and delivery. Again, another circumstance where you might not even be aware that you're entitled to duty drawback, but if you went back to your manufacturer, the manufacturer of the product, you might find ultimately that yes, oh yes, we do use imported product in our process. Or we use domestic product, but we also import or receive this imported product that's the same. A certificate of manufacturing delivery is required when the imported merchandise is subject to manufacture before delivery. Merchandise is delivered on the CM&D and then may be exported as is or undergo further steps. And again, just like the certificate of delivery, you are required to keep the CM&D under law. You want to keep it. That's your evidence that you received a product manufactured with the imported product. And then you would then use that to prepare your drawback claim. And in this case, we have the you can see, by law, it's the exporter who's entitled to receive the drawback. However, the exporter can endorse those rights back to parties in the chain. So in this case, the exporter could endorse those rights back to the manufacturer, or could actually endorse them all the way back to the importer as well. And it's a simple 1- or 2-page document in which they waive their, the exporter would waive their rights to drawback to the manufacturer or the importer. They can be done on an individual basis, or they can be done in a blanket format. So a lot of times you'll see companies that have a regular ongoing course of trade with a manufacturer or an importer. They'll do an annual or multi-year blanket endorsement, endorsing back drawback rights. This is just kind of a summary. Who qualifies? You have the importer who manufactures and exports. You have the purchaser from the importer who manufactures and exports. And you have an exporter who purchases product made from the imported merchandise. And Ed, I think you're going to pick up from here.
Okay, thanks, Michael. Michael has given us kind of a high-level view of who qualifies, and hopefully at this point you've figured out where you fit into that picture. Are you an importer, a manufacturer, an exporter, multiple parties, or just one of those parties? One of the things you'll realize right away when you get into duty drawback is that you have to drill down a little bit further, and that's what I'm going to do in a couple of these sections. There are some basic types of drawback listed here: manufacturing drawback, unused merchandise drawback, rejected merchandise drawback, and petroleum drawback. And we'll take a brief look at each one of these. The two most popular types that are used today are the manufacturing and the unused merchandise drawback. So let's look at what qualifies you under manufacturing drawback. The key to manufacturing drawback is you have to do a manufacture. So what constitutes a manufacture? You need to create a product that has a different name, a different character, and a different use. It has to undergo what's called a substantial transformation, a new and different product. And that process to get to that new and different product needs to include money or capital, labor, and complexity. So you just cannot simply take a material, let's say a chemical, and add some water to it and call that a manufacture. It just simply may not qualify, but it could qualify under a different type of drawback. So you have to substantially transform the raw material that you're working with into a new and different product. In manufacturing drawback, there are two ways to approach doing it. The first is direct identification. And under direct identification manufacturing drawback, you import and pay duty. You then use either specific or alternate identification methods, and I'll go over that in a minute. You need to manufacture a new and different article, and you need to export. In direct identification, the concept here is that you have an export, and you need to be able to tie that export back to the exact import entry that was either used to make that product or that was exported from that product. Specific means you can tie it back by batch number or by lot number. So you've got a lot number on your import, you've got an identifying lot number on your export, and you can tie those two together. As an alternative to that, if you can't do that, you can do it by an identification method such as a FIFO or LIFO when you get involved in commingled fungible inventory. The more commonly used type of manufacturing drawback is called substitution drawback. And again, in substitution drawback, you import and pay duty, but you substitute same kind and quality merchandise, manufacture a new and different article, and then export. The substitution is the key part here, that same kind and quality aspect of it. Same kind and quality is a class or group of individual objects must be of the same nature, like copper and zinc are not the same kind of metal. Same quality means functionally interchangeable in the product, no significant change in the manufacturing process. So essentially what you have here is a situation in which you may have a dual source for the raw material that you're using. So you may import it, but you also may be purchasing that exact same raw material from a domestic supplier. And as long as the imported and the domestic sources of that particular raw material or item is same kind and quality, you can substitute one for the other. So again, if you're dealing with chemicals, for example, and your imported chemical goes into a tank and your domestically purchased chemical goes into the exact same tank, you have commingled fungible storage. How do you know which is which? You don't. And you don't want to keep track of them individually either in order to do drawback. And that's why substitution drawback was created. So if you look at it from the export side, your export could have been made from all imported merchandise. Or your export could have been made from all domestic merchandise. Or it could have been made from both of those, either one of them, or both, or any ratio of them, and you can still get the drawback. That's the concept behind substitution manufacturing drawback. In looking at the time frames, just briefly here, direct identification on the left, substitution on the right. For direct identification, you have a very simple 5 years from date of import to date of export. Substitution drawback, on the other hand, is just a little bit more complicated because you have some statutory requirements for the receipt and the use of the imported merchandise. So there's a time frame associated with that. And the same thing for the manufacture of the finished article. It has to have been manufactured during a 3-year time period in which you receive the imported merchandise. So substitution has its advantages, but at the same time, you have to watch your time frames very carefully. One of the things to note that across the board in drawback, you can pretty much reach back 3 years on your exports. And this is, in a lot of cases, a very nice windfall for companies that are just getting started in drawback because they've imported for many years, but they have not taken advantage of the drawback program. And so they can reach back 3 years and actually do drawback and exports that took place up to 3 years ago. But keep in mind that as each day goes by, exports could be falling off the table, as that 3-year period is a moving time period. Now, in order to do, or permit you to do duty drawback manufacturing specifically, as Michael said earlier, it's a privilege. So you have to apply for it from Customs. And in manufacturing drawback, that's done by way of a manufacturing ruling. Customs has issued what they call general rulings, which can be used in situations that are very common manufacturing scenarios. For example, they have a general ruling for an assembly operation. Basically, Customs has said, if you're doing an assembly operation, you're bolting something together, or you're soldering it, or welding it, or gluing it, or whatever. It's kind of the same concept being used. So they've issued general rulings, and you can just sign on to those with a few particulars about your company, and send them to Customs, and they will give you a relatively quick approval. But if you don't qualify under a general ruling, there are specific rulings in which you apply to Customs headquarters for. And a specific ruling outlines more complicated manufacturing processes. And essentially, in a specific ruling, you're identifying your company, your locations, but also you're telling Customs, this is what we're importing, and this is what we're buying domestically, and these are the specifications of those materials. And they are substitutable based on the specifications. And you tell Customs about your manufacturing process that they go through and the items that you're exporting. Along with that, a ruling, of course, will have a bunch of general agreements that you have to agree to. For example, on record keeping, you have to show Customs that you are going to keep the records to back up what you will eventually put in your drawback claim. Now, in order to do a drawback claim, you need certain records. So on an operational level, to start out with, if you import, you need to have the entry summary, the Customs Form 7501, which details what you're bringing in and how it's classified and what duty rate is being applied to it. But then you have to go a step further. You have to drill down to the commercial invoice. And the commercial invoice is going to tell you specifically what was imported and what the value, unit value, of the imported merchandise was. So these are two key documents to start the process. Then you need to go into your manufacturing records, because as part of the statutory and regulatory requirements, you need to show that you did receive those goods and that you did use them in a manufacturing process. Excuse me. You also have to show that you manufactured the exported article, and you may need to get involved in bills of material to show how much of what you imported was actually appearing in or used in the exported product. And in some instances, you may have to deal with waste records, especially if waste has a value and it becomes a considerable part of the process, your manufacturing process. On the export side, the records that you will need to look at will be something that shows proof of export, as an ocean bill of lading or an airway bill of lading. The export invoice as well gives the details of the quantity that you exported and what it is that you actually exported. Shippers' export declarations are often used to identify what the Schedule B number was for the item when it was exported. So these are the types of records that you would pull together to actually start your drawback claim. But let's take it one step further. Let's say that Customs decide to look in detail at your drawback claim and the supporting documentation for it. So they might be looking at auditing some portions or all of a particular drawback claim. And here they drill in a little bit further. So again, your entry summary, your import invoice, those are items that you use to prepare the claim. But now what Customs might want to look at in a little bit more detail are purchase orders, receiving reports to show that you physically did receive those goods, payment documents to show that you paid for the goods and or paid for the duty when they were imported, as well as some inventory records. On the manufacturing side, again, inventory control records. description of the manufacturing process or bill of materials would fit in very well here. Work orders to show that you actually produced, and made a product from that raw material, and the records associated with doing that. And, waste records, again, if those apply. On the export side, the export bills of lading and the export invoices, which were used to prepare the drawback claim, but as well, accounts receivable records to show that your customer paid you for the goods that they received from you. Records of delivery to the dock, purchase orders, SEDs as well. So you can see for an audit, it's a little bit more of a drill down into the records as compared to what you would actually use to prepare the drawback claim. Now, Michael's going to take us into some of those details on the unused merchandise drawback.
Thanks, Ed. Yeah, we're going to kind of follow along in a similar manner on unused, so to try to get you through the qualifications and all the subtleties. And you'll hear a lot of similar concepts here, so it won't necessarily be the first time. Unused merchandise. Well, what does that mean? Well, it doesn't necessarily mean it's untouched. There are some allowable operations that can be done to the item when it's in the United States, such as testing, cleaning, repacking, inspecting. Those are some of the common sorting, refurbishing, freezing. So there are a number of things that can be done, and these are things that are often done in distribution centers. An item comes in and it's tested and cleaned, and then it's exported out. That doesn't mean that it's been used. Still available for unused merchandise drawback. Two types of unused merchandise drawback. The first we're going to talk about is direct identification. And this follows very similar to the manufacturing. Just in manufacturing, you rarely see direct identification drawback used. In unused merchandise, you see it used more often, and I'll explain why. First element is you import and you pay duty on the product. You then are going to, and let me just skip first. While it's here, you're only going to perform allowable operations that we just talked about. And then let me go back, and now you will need to, as you export or destroy it, you will have to be able to show that specific item with direct identification, that specific item was the item that you imported in on a particular import shipment. That's called specific identification. What's the classic way to have specific identification? That would be some type of serial number, for example. That is not always the most common way. For a lot of products, we don't have a serial number on it. They're all not unique. They are what we might call fungible. And so therefore, what do? I'm keeping a bin full of my widgets, and I pull 5 out. How do I know what import shipment they came from? Well, you can use an alternate identification method, and then before you export or destroy the item. What are some of those? And those are approved accounting methods. First in, first out, last in, first out. Averaging, although averaging is not, it's actually been by rulings. It's really not as usable as you might expect. Low to high is a common one that's used. But the key point here is that if you are using direct identification, even though you have fungible goods, there is a way to directly identify that product from import to the export. But I would say the more common type of drawback is substitution, and I think you'll understand why. It's similar to what we heard from Ed with manufacturing. You import and pay the duty, but it allows substitution of commercially interchangeable merchandise. What does that mean? Well, Ed talked about same kind and quality merchandise. Commercially interchangeable, it's a similar concept. It's more than fungible, and I'll give you some, and we'll go in a second as to what what exactly commercial interchangeable means, but it's they're similar, or commercially they're the same. They're the same item. So you could export out an item that was not necessarily imported, but if it's commercially interchangeable with the imported item, match them up and claim drawback. And again, perform the allowable operations that we discussed earlier. Going back to this concept of commercial interchangeability, because it's important. What are the criteria that are considered? Government industry standards are one. You would expect if there are any standards out there, like let's say we're talking about a particular commodity, that if there are standards, well, they would fall within the same, the exported item and the imported item would fall within the same recognized standard. Harmonized tariff classification, well, they should be roughly the same tariff classification. Part numbers, often customs wants to see part numbers, and relative values. Down this slide here it says is values, but the way customs looks at it, relative, because obviously there's been value added in the sense that a product that's been imported and sitting in a warehouse, there's a bit of value that's been added. So you would expect it to be exported at a slightly higher value. I will say that these criteria, there are a lot of rulings on these. So if you have products that are, the import and the export products are very similar, and are close to these criteria, you're going to want to talk to someone, because you can reach out and get a ruling from customs to determine whether the product is in fact products are commercially interchangeable. This is the reason why we use, for the most part, the reason why we use direct identification today. Under the NAFTA treaty, the use of substitution is limited. So what you're left with is you can get drawback for unused merchandise that is in the same condition. What does that mean? How is that different than unused? Well, you can, some operations are allowed, cleaning, trimming, filing, slitting, cutting, packaging, which, those are fairly substantial operations, and they're still considered in the same condition. But, some of the things that you would see that are not in the same condition are asparagus imported to the United States, and it spoils, and it's exported out. That may not be considered in the same condition. What the NAFTA agreement requires is that you must use some inventory accounting method, or in other words, direct identification, in order to claim drawback when you export it, unused or same condition drawback when you export it out of the United States to Canada or Mexico. So that's the primary reason today you see direct identification still used. Here are the time frames, much simpler for unused merchandise drawback. It's essentially 3 years from date of import to date of export, and then 3 years from the date of the claim must be filed for that export. So from the date the claim is filed all the way back to the time of import, it can be as long as 6 years. But it has to be the 3 years date of import to date of export, and then you got another 3 years to your date of claim. And again, as Ed was saying with manufacturing, that gives you that ability to claim going back 3 years. If you're a new drawback claimant, you should be looking back and scouring to see what type of exports we had over the previous 3 years. Documentation to permit drawback. With unused merchandise, if you're using substitution, you want to get a substitution approval. A couple of ways to do that. You can get a non-binding approval, which a lot of companies do, from the Drawback Center. One of the 4 drawback centers. There's 4 drawback centers where you file. One is in New York, one is in Chicago, one is in Houston, and the last one on the West Coast is in San Francisco. But you can get a non-binding determination from that, and you would do this in cases where it's pretty clear that the items are commercially interchangeable. You also need to give, technically, when you file for unused merchandise drawback, you must give customs notice of your intent to export the item. You got to give them an opportunity to say, wait, I want to take a look at it when it leaves. But any filer that's filing in any regular basis gets what's called waiver of prior notice. And what you would do is you put together a filing showing customs what your records are that you maintain, and they will then approve you and say, okay, you can export out at will. You just will need to maintain your proof of export and your export and paperwork so that we can check every once in a while if we do an audit. Retroactivity. Now, this would be the situation where you haven't got the waiver of prior notice, and you're a new claimant, but you've got exports going back 3 years. You're allowed to go back that retroactive time frame of 3 years, but they essentially give it to you a one-time shot. And you would file very similar records for the waiver of prior notice, showing, well, what records do we keep to show that we actually exported product out that was substitution product or product that was eligible for drawback. The fourth thing, main item that you want to consider with unused merchandise approvals, you don't have to have it, but any company that is doing drawback on a regular basis is going to want this. It's accelerated payment. What accelerated payment means, those of you familiar with imports, you know that imports are imported and then they go through a process where they are finally liquidated. And the same with drawback claims. Drawback claims are filed and they go through a process when they're finally liquidated. And that can take time, sometimes years, for it to be finally liquidated. And without accelerated payment, you don't get paid your money until it's finally liquidated. And like I said, that could take 1, 2, 3 years for that to happen. They developed a number of years ago the concept of the program for accelerated payment, and what you do is you ask customs for a benefit here. You show them the records that you keep, and they will then give you your money within 2 to 3 weeks after the claim is filed. And then you would have to file a bond as well. So it's a very important thing to have. Import records, just like Ed said before, the entry summary, 7501, the commercial import invoices, which is going to identify the item itself that you're importing and then subsequently exporting. Export records, the export bill of lading, the export invoices. Shipper's export declaration, well, today we know that as the EEI, the electronic export information. That's a good thing to have. It's not the main proof of export, though, is your export bill of lading. Now, that's what you need to be able to put together the claim. What do you need for audit? There's a little bit more that you might need to have, and in fact, you will go over this when you're preparing your waiver of prior notice claim. You will go over what your records are, and you'll have to tell customs what those are. But you're going to need to keep the purchase orders, the receiving reports, payment documents, inventory records to be able to support that. Export records, we talked about the bills of lading and the export invoices, records showing delivery to the dock, purchase orders, and the EEI, or what used to be called the SED. And Ed, I think you're going to show us what this duck is going to do with the computer.
Destroy something.
And let me use the segue just to remind all the participants that if questions come to you, you can go ahead and type those in on your screen at the Q&A tab, and then after this next tranche of slides, in just a few minutes, we will have a question and answer session. Thank you, Ed.
All right, thanks, Kelly. I'm going to briefly go over two other types of drawback. Obviously, manufacturing drawback and unused merchandise drawback are the two main ones. Rejected merchandise is another type of drawback. And essentially, if you import something that is not conforming to the sample or the specifications that you put out, or it was shipped without your consent In other words, you got something that you weren't supposed to get, or it's determined to be defective at the time of importation, you can file a rejected merchandise claim. The only problem with rejected merchandise is that you need to return the goods to customs custody. And this is often a problem because in a lot of instances, if you receive some merchandise like this, you may find an immediate customer for it and be able to export it right away and get some money back for it. And you will not have the time to send it to customs custody. So what a lot of companies do, instead of doing a rejected merchandise drawback, they do this type of thing under unused merchandise drawback, which is allowable to do. So you don't see a whole lot of rejected merchandise drawback today, but it is definitely out there. A new type of drawback is now called petroleum drawback, and this is a very interesting concept. Basically, it has to do with petroleum products or petroleum derivatives. And if you look in Chapter 39 of the Harmonized Tariff Schedule of the United States, this is where you will find most of the items that qualify under petroleum drawback. The way this works is that if you can match your import and your export by the 8-digit tariff classification for that item coming out of, like I said, mostly out of Chapter 39, you qualify for petroleum drawback. What you have to do, though, is you have to import and export within a 180-day time frame. So there's a trade-off. You get the very simplified substitution on an 8-digit tariff schedule level, but you have to do it within a 6-month time period, the import to the export. Petroleum drawback is, obviously we import a lot of petroleum into the United States. We make a lot of petroleum products that get exported, and this is becoming a fast-growing area. So by all means, take a look at Chapter 39, and if you are involved in importing and exporting any items coming out of the tariff schedule in that chapter, you should take advantage of this. Well, we've dealt with the types of drawback and what it takes to file a claim and get approved and what records you have to keep. But as always, Customs is going to lift the hood and they're going to take a look at what you've actually been doing. At some point in time, you are going to be audited to some degree by Customs. And verification today is done on a number of levels. There is a desk audit, there's a compliance review, there's regulatory audit, and there's focused assessment. A desk audit is the most common way that Customs reviews a claim today. If you file a claim, if you're a first-time claimant, your very first claim will be desk audited by Customs. That's a guarantee. And you will get at least one desk audit a year from Customs. Essentially what they're doing in this type of review, they send you a letter. And they say, we want to see the backup documentation for an import entry, and they'll tell you exactly what import entry from your claim they want to look at. So there you need to provide the 7501 and the invoice and some of the detail to go with that. Same thing on the export side on that claim. They'll pick 3 exports from that claim, and they'll say, show us the proof of exports, maybe some purchase orders, invoices, packing lists, that type of thing. So they'll take a look at the claim itself and make sure that your calculations are correct. The next level that they will go to is what's called a compliance review. And essentially a compliance review is a desk audit, but it's done on site. So they're going to come out for a visit for a day or a few hours. And they're basically going to take that desk review letter that they sent you, and they're going to sit down with you, and you're going to walk them through the documentation that supports that claim. And we're starting to see an increasing number of this type of review in Customs today. Beyond that, of course, is regulatory audit, which is a full-blown audit of your whole drawback program. And this can take any number of days or weeks to actually do. Customs has not done a lot of them. They just don't have the resources to do it, but occasionally there will be a full-blown audit. Compliance is important in drawback, and keeping records is one of the most important things because, as you've seen in the time frames, drawback can cover a long period of time. And some of those time frames might fall out of your company record-keeping policies. So when you do drawback, you need to go back and look at your record-keeping policy and make sure that it covers the time frames for drawback. The records need to provide the traceability from import to manufacture to export. You've got to have that flow in your records. And if you have additional parties, as we talked about, if you're not the importer, if you're not the exporter, and you get this information from other parties, those parties have to keep those records as well. Within your own company, you have to be able to coordinate the records, whether you're talking to your purchasing people, your manufacturing people, or your transportation folks. Each of them are going to have a piece of the puzzle in order to do drawback, and you've got to be able to pull all of that together and show customers that you've got a good handle on the records that you need to support the drawback claim. Customers will accept, summaries of initial, documentation if that's the way you keep your records. For example, in SAP, print screens, because hard copies simply aren't kept anymore. So Customs is more and more transitioning to, the electronic type of record. And your records need to be kept for 3 years after date of payment of the drawback claim. But I caution you on that. Because some drawback claims do not get liquidated by Customs immediately, it can go beyond that 3-year period very easily. So don't just assume that after 3 years you can just get rid of the records. If your claim is not liquidated, it's good advice to just hold on to those records until the claim gets liquidated. Okay, Michael's going to take a little bit more of a detailed look at some of the compliance involving drawback.
Yeah, thanks, Ed. And I'm going to kind of run through this really quickly because we are getting towards the end of our time and we have a few questions that we're going to want to hit. What happens if you're not in compliance? Just like any other thing in Customs, there are penalties. And of course there are criminal penalties. I don't want, that slide is there, but you don't, that's not typical. In fact, I can't remember the last time I heard of something like that taking place. But there's civil penalties. They are out there. They didn't used to exist, but about 10 years ago, 12 years ago, Customs enacted a statute. So, it points up you want to do it right because you don't want to go out and seek a refund only to find out that, well, not only do we have to pay that refund back, but we also have penalties that are attached to it. And it's based very similar to the way that Customs does their other penalties. It's based on the level of culpability, fraud, and negligence. So enough said about that, but I think it's enough to know that that's out there. The next slide, we just want to quickly let everybody know that there has been a lot of discussion about drawback modernization. I know you've heard it's a very complex process, but there is a move afoot in Congress to simplify drawback. Customs is on board with that. They want to see simplification as well. The main tenets of that are 8-digit HTS substitution, something that may sound familiar, just like petroleum, very similar to petroleum. That substitution, instead of commercial interchangeability or same kind of quality, would be based on the same 8-digit HTS. You would claim the average duty from the line item as opposed to having to dig to the import paperwork, the import invoice to get it. And it would be coordinated with the new automated commercial environment that is being developed by U.S. Customs. Okay, and then the last couple slides, that's Ed's contact information and then mine as well.
Let's go ahead then and jump into some questions because there are some good ones that came up and I want to be sensitive to everybody's time if that's okay. Ed and Mike?
Sure.
Terrific. And let me also invite the operator, because in addition to the type questions that have been submitted, we'll try and work through those. So you have the chance to, we'll probably get to a couple of verbal questions. Operator, did you want to make a comment on that?
Yes, as a reminder to ask a question, please press star then 1 and be sure to unmute your phone and clearly record your name. Again, that's star then 1, and we'll allow a few moments for any questions to come in.
Okay. And while Mike and Ed look at the questions that have been submitted, I'll just go ahead and jump in with one of them, which I think is a great place to start for a company that is not doing, taking advantage of Drawback, but it seems to apply to their company. What do you suggest as a first step, after they gather their documentation, how to get started on the retroactive, applicability as well as new shipments?
Well, one of the first things that you need to do is determine what type of drawback you're going to be doing. Once you've ascertained that, then you want to go into getting permitted by customs to be able to do the drawback. So if you're doing manufacturing drawback, you need to put together a drawback ruling, and that's outlined in the appendix to the regulations, Part 191, for drawback. So, once you put together your application, that goes to customs. Customs approves that, and then you can start filing for drawback and putting together the actual drawback claims themselves.
Yeah, the only thing I'll add to that is that, and I don't want to sound self-serving here, but because I do have a drawback, a brokerage that specializes in this, but I think Ed would agree. Most of the problems that we see out there are when companies don't seek out advice. So even if you want to do it yourself, seek out advice. It's a specialized area, and even the process of putting out an RFP can be helpful to get information as to how to do your drawback program. I saw let's see, I have a question here that says, in order to qualify, do the articles, materials imported have to be of foreign origin? You have to pay duty. That's what it's about. If you import product and pay duty, then you can claim drawback. Okay.
Operator, is there someone on the line with a question?
I show no questions at this time. As a reminder, if you do have a question, please press star then 1.
We'll continue with these that have been posted.
Okay. Michael, here's one on, we imported capital equipment used to manufacture products, some of which products are exported and some of which are sold domestically. Can we recover any of the duties on the capital equipment? No, you can't. Capital equipment would have been used for its intended purpose, and therefore it does not qualify for drawback. For example, under unused merchandise drawback, it has to be unused, and capital equipment you would have used. The second question part there is there a ratio based on the products exported or some other basis? No, it's again, eliminating the capital equipment part of it totally. So you're making product and you're exporting product, and it's based on how much you actually export. When you look at the export side, you're looking at the quantity being exported. And then you're going back to the import side and determining how much duty was associated with the raw materials that were used to make that export.
Okay, the next question I have here, and this is a good one too, does duty drawback become more difficult as far as tracking and keeping records when we are importing goods as a North American distributor for a foreign affiliate, and we are selling goods unused both domestically and exporting? That is probably the most common situation of unused. Very seldom do you have a company that is only selling for export. So I would say to you that I'm not sure that it becomes any more difficult. And particularly if you're using substitution drawback, it should not be a problem at all.
Excuse me, we do have a question on the phone.
Let's go ahead and take that.
I believe it's Candy.
Hello, yes. We were wondering if the manufacturer who imported the goods needs to be the payer as well as the payer for the goods that are exported. You understand my question?
If the manufacturer of the imported goods needs to have paid for those goods?
Yes, as well as be the payer for the exported goods.
Or the payee, I guess, meaning that when they export out the goods, are they the ones who are being paid for it?
Correct.
It's at the time, the import side of it is based upon who the importer of record is. So regardless of who actually does the payment, if you will, for the import shipment. If you are the importer of record, then when you import that product, then there's certain rights that you have. You can export that product and get drawback, or you could provide a certificate of delivery to somebody else. So if you're the importer of record, that's the key. It's not so much about the payment, it's really of whether you're the importer of record. And on the export side, you do need to be the exporter of record. The exporter of record is the party that gains the primary benefit of the export transaction. Boy, that sounds like a lot of legal mumbo jumbo, but essentially, it's the entity that's going to get some benefit from that export transaction, the party who is selling the product. So, what Customs often looks for is who's listed on the export documents as the exporter of record. So, not knowing exactly how the situation goes, I would say that what exactly situation you have, but I would say that you have very good likelihood, if it's set up correctly, that you could still get drawback.
Because most of my exports of finished goods are sent on a constantly routed basis or purchased on a constantly routed basis.
Well,
so if they collect overseas, will I still be able to do a drawback program?
Yeah, let's say, for example, you looked at this scenario. So it's a routed transaction, you're saying, and quite often in a routed transaction, you may not be the exporter of record, but it's very common to get a waiver of the drawback rights from the party that you sell to. In fact, there's a lot of companies today that use routed transactions for their export sales. They have that as part of their export sale process. They get a waiver every year, or even on an individual sale basis from the customer saying that we waive our drawback rights, which would then waive them back to you, and then you could claim the drawback.
Thanks.
Thank you.
I want to remind all the participants that we will be circulating, following this program, a link to replay the recording of it, as well as a copy of the presentation and contact information, where you can get additional clarification from Mr. Venick and Mr. Cerny. So we have time just for a couple more questions. Are there any in the queue that you particularly want to address? Ned?
There's one here about purchasing a tablet machine from Taiwan and producing supplements, then export to Asia. We pay duty on the importing the machine. Does that qualify for duty drawback? Again, if that machine is capital equipment that is used to produce those supplements, then no, it does not qualify for drawback. But if the supplements that you are producing on that machine are being made from raw materials that were imported, then those supplements may qualify for drawback.
Important clarification. Is there another person on the line with a verbal question, operator?
At this time, I'm showing no questions on the phone lines. As a reminder, to ask a question, please press star then 1.
I see a question here about defense articles and do they qualify. Again, if you import product, pay duty on it, and then export it out of the United States, regardless of what it is, you can get drawback. They even get drawback on satellites that are sent to outer space.
Interesting. And would either of you like to make any last comments or clarifications?
Well, just for me, thanks to everybody for listening. I know it's a complex subject, but believe it or not, once a program gets going, it can work like clockwork for you, and it's just a tremendous benefit for exporters in the United States.
Yeah, Michael, and I would add to that there are thousands of companies doing drawback in the United States today, but unfortunately there are thousands more that are not taking advantage of this program. We estimate that there's approximately $30 billion in duty being paid to Customs every year, and the drawback being claimed from that pool is only around $750 million. So there is an awful lot of drawback out there that companies are not taking advantage of, and I would encourage each of you to take a look at the program and see if it works for you.
Well, thank you so much for your time and expertise. And for those questions that we haven't gotten to, can the participants contact you directly for further clarification?
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely.
Terrific. Wonderful. Well, again, thank you so much, and I want to thank the participants for sticking with us a little bit past the time allotted. Watch for the presentation materials, and check back in for other programs on the basics of exporting at export.gov/webinars. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.